One of the advantages of coming to Orwell on his centenary is that though so many of his friends have unfortunately died, a great deal of archive material that wasn't previously available is now to hand. Here are all the original letters that Victor Gollancz wrote to Orwell's agent, Leonard Moore, in the early 1930s. They're full of interesting biographical fragments. And here's a letter from the 22nd of July 1932. My dear Moore, Eric Blair, I'm now able to make an offer for the manuscript in its present form. This was the manuscript of Down and Out in Paris and London. And it's interesting that Orwell was already thinking of changing his name from Eric Blair, because Gollantz's second point is, I do not in the least mind under what name it is published. Interesting from the biographer's point of view is a little note at the end of this letter from Orwell's agent, which says, if I could hear from you by tomorrow, Friday, I should be glad, as Blair is going abroad. Now, this is the end of July 1932. I know nothing about Blair going abroad at the end of July 1932. There is no note or record of it anywhere else in his writings or letters. Where was he going? Was it his agent's ruse to try and get a quick reply from the publisher? I don't think we shall ever know. Then, in 1936, Orwell's life changed. Victor Gollancz, his publisher, suggested that he should investigate conditions in the blighted, depression-hit North. Orwell's journey, which resulted in the book The Road to Wigan Pier, had a galvanizing effect on his consciousness. It produced some of his most dazzling pieces of reportage.
She looked up as the train passed, and I was almost near enough to catch her eye. She had a round, pale face, the usual exhausted face of the slum girl who is 25 and looks 40. And it wore, for the second in which I saw it, the most desolate, hopeless expression I have ever seen. We are mistaken when we say that it isn't the same for them as it would be for us, and that people bred in the slums can imagine nothing but the slums. She understood, as well as I did, how dreadful a destiny it was to be kneeling there in the bitter cold, on the slimy stones of a slum backyard, poking a stick up a foul drain pipe.
Orwell was keen to explore the reality of working-class life, in particular that of the miners. Joe Kennan accompanied Orwell on his first trip to the coalface and recalled his experience in this 1971 interview. Kennan was only 5 feet tall, while Orwell stood well over 6 foot.
The weight of the roof had bent a number of girders, and we hadn't gone more than 300 yards when Orwell just didn't duck his head quick enough. Hit him, knocked the helmet off, knocked him down. He was flat out. The working face was, I think, 26 inches. And by the time we landed there, Orwell was, unquestionably, he was exhausted. And I said to him, it's a so-and-so good job. They don't know what you're down here for, to write a book about mining. Has to be a fall of roof and bury you.
Joe Kennan needn't have worried. Orwell's book paid due respect to the work of the miners.
It is only because miners sweat their guts out that superior persons can remain superior. You and I and the editor of the Times Literary Supplement and the Nancy poets and the Archbishop of Canterbury, all of us owe the comparative decency of our lives to poor drudges underground, blackened to the eyes with their throats full of coal dust, driving their shovels forward with arms and belly muscles of steel.
Some previous biographers of Orwell have stressed the importance of his trip north as the defining moment in his conversion to socialism. But looking at his diaries, I'm not sure it was so immediate. This is an entry from February 1936. Mr. Mead sent me across to Wigan to see Joe Kennan, an electrician who takes a prominent part in the socialist movement. Now, he might as well be talking about the temperance movement, for all the connection he has with it. At this stage, Orwell simply hadn't fully identified himself with the left. It wasn't so much the deprivations of England that converted Orwell to socialism. It was the horrors of Spain. In the last days of 1936, Orwell set out for Barcelona to enlist as a volunteer in the Spanish Civil War. Orwell had attached himself to the Trotskyist POUM on the Aragon front, narrowly missing death when a sniper's bullet winged through his throat. Later, in Barcelona, he was an eyewitness to the communist-inspired suppression of the militias and only just escaped with his life. Despite the vicious infighting on the Republican side, the war brought Orwell into daily contact with men who not only held left-wing views, but were prepared to die for them. It was this, above all else, that converted him to the socialist cause. 2 years later, with the war lost, he wrote this poem to commemorate the Italian soldier who'd shaken his hand on the day he joined the militia.
Your name and your deeds forgotten before your bones were dry, and the lie that slew you is buried under a deeper lie. But the thing that I saw in your face, no power can disinherit. No bomb that ever burst shatters the crystal spirit.
Before leaving for Spain, Orwell had met and married Eileen O'Shaughnessy. Back in England with Eileen, laid low by the first signs of tuberculosis, he was an increasingly disillusioned man, struggling to make sense of his time. 60 years on, some of his opinions seem highly questionable.
I never, in the short time I knew Orwell, ever managed to get him to say anything very derogatory about Adolf Hitler. And then, I think it was in 1942, I was electrified to read Orwell's review of a new edition of Mein Kampf, which he begins with, I wish to put it on record that I have never felt any dislike of Adolf Hitler. And then he goes on to compare his face with that of a suffering Christ. Well, this seemed to me quite extraordinary, and still does.
What I do feel is that any Jew, European Jew, would prefer Hitler's kind of social system to ours if it were not that he happens to persecute them. They make use of England as a sanctuary, but they cannot help feeling the profoundest contempt for it. You can see this in their eyes, even when they don't say it outright.
It's easy to say that's anti-Semitism. Well, a Jew may feel that, and after the Holocaust, of course, we tend to be more sensitive about that. But at that time, many people were casually, inconsiderately, not so much anti-Jewish, but careless about the way they spoke of Jews.
Orwell knows that he is running the risk of being anti-Semitic. But if you're going to be interested in prejudice, as Orwell is, those are risks clearly you have to take. And I think Orwell really wants to press the question, why has anti-Semitism persisted? Orwell is arguing as a writer for the freedom to talk about prejudice.
And yet Orwell's attitude to Jewishness is not at all straightforward. He had countless Jewish friends. Both his publishers were Jewish. So were many of his literary acquaintances. And so was a 19-year-old boy with whom he served in the St. John's Wood platoon of the Home Guard in 1940. I mean, you came across him obviously off duty and at times when you weren't actually going about your jobs in the Home Guard. What did you surmise about Orwell's attitude to the Jews and Jewish people, and what was then known as the Jewish question?
I used to tell him my views, which was the same as any views, I think, as regards the Germans, the same as like any Englishman's views. Mine were possibly a little stronger because I was Jewish, and although they hadn't started gassing the Jews in 1940, there was certainly a lot of problems over in Europe. But I felt Orwell was sympathetic in his views. After the war, when I read his 7 books, I was quite amazed at some of the references that he did make to Jews. Although I think when one looks at how novelists wrote in the pre-war days, certainly going back to Victorian times, this was probably par for the course.